What is up, my friends? It is your host, Nick Anderson, also known as Amongst the Whiskey, and today we're going to be diving in on bottle-to-bottle variation and what that means for you. With me is amongstthewhiskey.com co-author Jes Smyth. Jes, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me here today. I think we are definitely in need of talking about this topic, especially because you and I as reviewers are doing our best to bring valuable reviews to our readers, and we are noticing a difference between bottles, it seems.
The fickle nature of blending, the fickle nature of single barrels at work, perhaps.
Yes. We got to dive deeper.
We have to dive deeper. This is going to be an incredible discussion. On we go.
Yes.
So for our discussion today, I think we're going to lean in on three examples. So the big one that I noticed was what really sparked this idea for us to talk about today was the Michter's single barrel variation. So for the Michter's 10-year bourbon, I've noticed a pretty significant difference between A barrels and later barrels like D or E or F. And what those letters mean are actually the bottling month for when Michter's bottles those single barrels. Mm-hmm. So 23A would represent January from that month, A meaning January, and then B, February, C, March, D, April, and so on and so forth. So where this was really apparent was, I think for the first time, really noticeable in the 2023 bottlings of Michter's 10-year bourbon. The internet went crazy for 23A barrels, myself included. I did one of the earlier reviews of a 23A barrel. It tasted like beautiful pre-fire Heaven Hill to me. Obviously, that is a type of whiskey that I think you're a big fan of as well, Jes.
Oh, yes, definitely.
I mean, how could you go wrong with something that tastes as magnificent as pre-fire Heaven Hill? That earthy clay, that sweet vanilla. There are parallels to post-fire Heaven Hill there, too. Regardless of source, I think throughout the year, Michter's will try to use the same source for those barrels. Mm-hmm. I think when people talk about vintages, like they would talk about in wine, you could call a 2020 wine that year's production. We can't use the same terms in single barrel whiskey like Michter's does. So I think we need to retool how we talk about this kind of thing. We can't really talk about it in vintages anymore when it's a single barrel product. Mm. I've been trying to highlight that in my reviews of the 10-year bourbon, but how do we shift that conversation away from saying, oh, the 2023 Michter's 10-year bourbon? How do we shift the conversation to bring the focus back to single barrel?
Yeah, I think we need to highlight the letters more. I think it cannot just be a blanket, this is a 2023 Michter's bourbon that I really liked. I think people need to be more aware of those tiny letters on the label and that it does make a difference, that there's reviewers like you and I that are noticing these differences. And if you're getting a 2023 or 2024A, and you want to get another one that's similar, it might not, C or D might not be the same. And it's also important to maybe understand why A, B, C, and D are different. And maybe that's where the whiskey appreciator or whatever taster can have a better understanding when they go to purchase, is to understand maybe why these barrels are different.
We may not have all the answers. I think we can dig in on exactly your point that you mentioned there on why bottling in January may be different than bottling in June. Mm-hmm. But just to ground everybody, I'm going to grab the bottle of Michter's 10-year bourbon, highlight that neck tag so folks can see what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Take those panties off. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to make you blush halfway through this. We gotta laugh about that for a moment.
Take these panties off.
Isn't that what you think about when you take off the neck tags from bottles? That's exactly what I think about.
I will now. I absolutely have never thought about that. I just thought it was a neck tag. Oh my God, you've changed neck tags for me. Okay.
Neck tags are changed forever now.
I need to drink the water.
Well,
Okay,
we weren't
focus.
expecting to laugh like that halfway through this already, but here we go.
Okay.
So right here is really what we're talking about, that neck tag. You can see this one is 24D. I say you can see it, but you really kind of can't because it's in this like handwritten font.
Yeah.
And after that letter is just a unique identifier for the barrel number as well. So 24D, this one is 24D1904. So this is another bottle that I scored of the Michter's 10-year bourbon beyond the 24F that I reviewed at amongstthewhiskey.com. And I think noticing just the actually almost similarities between my review of 24F and a couple of tastes that I've done on this 24D is that it definitely feels like the same source. There's definitely differences between the two, but I still was not all that crazy for this 24D bottling. Is that because of the bottling month or just the source? I wonder, because 23 was almost definitely sourced from Heaven Hill. The flavor profile that I got on that was just screaming that Heaven Hill vanilla. This one feels a little younger. I'm getting some like vinegar tones on it. Kind of feels like Brown Foreman to me, so your Old Forester, which tends to drink younger, hotter,
Yeah.
but obviously still satisfies the 10-year age statement that they're going for on this label. What do you think, Jess? Is it more the source for the differences between my appreciation of 23 to 24, or is it more the bottling month, the letter on the neck tag here?
I think for Michter's, you and I have talked about where these barrels age, and it is temperature controlled, so that kind of takes out the elements a little bit. I think especially because it's a single barrel, the source, and they're sourcing, I think the source has a lot to do with it. And single barrels, even if you're not sourcing, they can have variation in between those barrels regardless, even if it was straight up Michter's.
Definitely.
So I think in this case, and especially because they temperature control their warehouses, I think that's what we discussed. I think that it has to do with the sourcing. Yeah. Or maybe the cooperage. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point, because really the distillery only makes the new make. The cooperage is going to define how that continues to age for 5, 10, 15 years.
Right.
You raise a good point there. Cooperage might actually play a bigger role in variation of Michter's 10-year bourbon than most people are really aware of. Good point. I mean, base distillate has to be good to make good whiskey. Good cooperage has to be done to also make good whiskey. So both play a really pivotal role in the ultimate quality. And Michter's is obviously a brand that knows quality. They're very discerning palates. They're sourcing barrels that they know can go the distance. I mean, as part of their action plan from going from an NDP to a distiller, they ultimately had to make a choice of who they went with for sourcing those barrels, because that's what they're kind of building their legacy on.
Right.
And I just notice a pretty stark difference between 2023 and 2024. But I have read a few great reviews of 2024A and 2024B barrels of the Michter's 10-year bourbon from this year.
Yeah.
Does that lend credence to the fact that earlier barrels, bottling near January, say, or February, is that inherently better than bottling in the summer months? That's a whole science experiment that we could go down.
Yeah, you would. I can see you totally doing that.
That I totally do not have time to execute, but I would love to do. If I had a team of 20 engineers at my disposal to just nerd out on whiskey, that is something I would send 3 of them to go do right now.
Put it in your 10-year plan.
10-year plan for amongstthewhiskey.com is large team of engineers to properly nerd out on all the things that are worth nerding out on.
Yeah. Answer these questions. We got to get more people curious about this stuff, and to have the answers helps.
Yeah. It's one thing to pose a question, it's another thing to offer a solution. But there is some science behind bottling in January versus bottling in June.
Mm-hmm.
It's the nature of how whiskey matures, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially in Kentucky, and maybe these effects are kind of dampened by the fact that, to your point, Michter's does the heat cycled warehouses.
Right.
Maybe that effect is dampened a little bit, but in the hot summer months, you see pressure inside the whiskey barrels expanding because temperature goes up. This is simple math, simple science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that whiskey is pushing into the wood. And you can, when you disassemble a whiskey barrel and you look at one of those staves, you can see that depth that the whiskey penetrated. Sometimes it's nigh on all the way to the outside of the barrel because of really high temperatures, really high pressures. And so I wonder, how much are you losing bottling in June in Kentucky versus bottling in January, where a ton of that whiskey is in the wood at that moment?
Yeah.
And that is flavorful whiskey because that whiskey is interacting with the pore structure of the oak itself.
Yeah.
So it seems counterintuitive to bottle in June. If at all possible, I would much prefer to see everybody bottle in, I don't know, say October through March, because you're just going to maximize how much that barrel produced for you.
Yeah.
But I get how that is not possible probably for every whiskey producer. You need to continue to have whiskey throughout the year. You can't front load all of your bottling expeditions to, 4 months of the year. So I see the need for bottling and dumping barrels in the summer. And I think there's a lot of literature from big brands that say, oh, it doesn't matter. But they have a commercial interest in saying that that doesn't matter. Of course, Heaven Hill, which makes, millions of barrels of whiskey every year, is going to say, oh, you can bottle it any time of the year. It's always going to be the same. We have a vanilla profile. You're going to love it no matter what. Come here for a barrel pick in June. We'll get it bottled by July. And, you're going to love that whiskey. But that's not really how maturation works.
Right.
So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. How do we go about meeting somewhere in the middle? How do we go about understanding the effects of bottling month on whiskey?
Don't know.
It's a beast.
We had talked about Michter's 10-year rye versus their 10-year bourbon, and the variation between rye and the ABCD seems to be less. Not as
We've
fickle.
noticed less. Sure.
Yes, we've noticed less. So not to add more into this pot of confusion, but it could also be just rye versus bourbon hanging out in those barrels. Maybe rye is a little bit more substantial against, being aged with that wood, and bourbon's bourbon's mostly corn. Bourbon is a little bit more like susceptible to those fluctuations in that barrel, and I don't know. So it could be, again, bourbon versus rye as well.
Could be mash bill dependent.
Yeah.
Or does that harken back to the discussion of cooperage and distillery?
Yeah.
Where the ryes from, say, 2023, which I think we had an exceptional experience with. I think it was our number one rye.
Yes.
On our top 24 rye list. Michter's knows how to produce great whiskey, and so does it harken back to then cooperage or base distillate on the rye versus the bourbon?
Yeah.
I have absolutely no clue where they're sourcing their rye from.
Wherever they are, it's delicious.
For sure. I mean, we have links galore that we can put to fantastic Michter's 10-year whiskey, especially that rye. We'll probably drop a link to the top 24 rye list as well, so everybody at home can enjoy the fruits of our labor there. But perhaps we don't have the answers, but it's an interesting discussion. So I really want to see what more people from the community have for experience on this front. I would love to get expert opinions from people like Dan McKee, people that are actually on the front lines of producing this stuff. How does that bottling month play a role? And again, you got to kind of strip back the layers of their potential commercial interests and saying, all is hunky-dory, and really try to get down to the brass tacks of it.
I also wonder if the smaller craft distilleries would have more of a thumb on this pulse, because they're a smaller operation. And just thinking about Whiskey Acres here and here, they are all farmers, and they do everything, right? So I wonder if they have paid attention to when they bottle and if it has made a difference in their flavor profile or whatever.
Absolutely.
So
That's a great point.
craft distilleries have a little bit of insight too.
So it looks like we maybe have a little bit of homework to do. I think we should
Yeah.
reach out to some of our contacts in
Mm-hmm.
the whiskey world and see if we can get a little bit more color to this issue.
Yeah, I agree.
But at the end of the day, I feel like the driving factor in variation for, say, Michter's 10-year bourbon or Michter's 10-year rye is the fact that they're single barrel.
Yeah.
And I think more people need to be aware of that and need to be talking about Michter's, especially single barrel products, in terms of it being single barrel.
Yeah.
Especially when people are making broad recommendations. Go out and buy the 2024 Michter's 10-year bourbon. It seems like people need to be a little bit more specific than that, than just making those broad statements.
Yeah, I agree.
The importance of doing your homework.
The importance of being curious.
That too. I mean, at the end of the day, single barrels are inherently variable. It's why people like us love to go select single barrels. You find one that's very special, very keyed to your personality or your taste buds, and you lean in on that. So
Yeah.
Michter's is doing just that. I think they're doing a great job at consistency, but it does seem like there is some throughout the year variation. I think in general they're harvesting the same flavor profile, but the same distillate in the same cooperage barrels is not going to taste the same when you bottle it in January versus you bottle it in June.
Yeah.
I think that's ultimately the finding of what I've been tasting, exploring through single barrels throughout the year. I'd love to continue to pull on that thread throughout time as we continue to taste through single barrels, as
Yeah.
we continue to talk to distillers, craft distillers, anybody that has really got a solid feel for this. Whiskey nerds like us.
Yes. Do you prefer their earlier bottlings? Do you prefer like the A, B, C's?
So far, I have always preferred the A's. So I did
Yeah.
exactly that exploration on the 2023 bottlings. I had a 23A and I had a 23E.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a 23F. Either way, I much preferred the 23A. I could see the similarities between the two, but in a side-by-side tasting, I way preferred the A. The
Yeah.
23A barrel that I got, which I think I remember the whole barrel number. This is how exceptional it was. It was 23A0042. It was barrel 42 of 23A Michter's 10-year bourbon. There is a couple of folks that have the same barrel, the same bottle in Massachusetts, and they go crazy for this stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
I first opened one with some dear friends at a Mass Bourbon Alliance event. I exclaimed to the room, "You're going to tell me this is not pre-fire Heaven Hill? This is amazing whiskey right here." Immediately got my own bottle, and had a couple of other people reach out and say, "Hey, which barrel did we try that night? I need that
Yeah.
one, that
Yeah.
particular barrel."
Right.
And it was 23A0042. I remember the exact barrel number.
You live up to the whiskey nerd term there.
I'd say.
All right. Well, you just got to keep paying attention to those. Maybe you'll end up liking a later barrel eventually.
It's certainly possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, the general trend for right now, though, is that
Those
the
earlier ones.
earlier bottlings seem to be them leading with their best. And there actually could be something to that from a marketing perspective,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Now that you bring that up. I mean, when the kind of whiskey review cycle for the year's bottlings turns over, you're going to want to get your best reviews in early so that people want to buy your product. So there is kind of this underlying inner workings of the whiskey review world where distilleries will often send out media samples and media bottles to some of their most trusted industry advisors, and so people will get early bottlings. People will get a media sample of 24A or 24B. And those are the reviews that I read. Those are people that did get a free bottle from Michter's that were early letters. They were
Yeah.
A's and B's, and the reviews were quite favorable. Now, were they favorable because Michter's knew that they were going to send out these barrels, and so they honeypicked their best barrels for the earlier bottlings
Yeah.
so that they would get good reviews? Or did they just get good reviews because
Yeah.
the people that received them got a free bottle?
Yeah. It also makes me wonder if Michters or just brands in general don't want the consumers to be paying attention to those tiny little letters after the 23. Maybe they want to lead with their best and then be like, throughout the year, if someone hears that Michter's 2024 bourbon, 10-year bourbon is great, maybe they want the consumers to not be as aware of what barrel they're picking up on the shelf. They just want them to be excited to see the Michter's label with the 10-year bourbon, which I know I would be. I would be.
Yeah. You see a Michter's 10-year bourbon at MSRP on the shelf, it's like, it's
it.
a magical moment.
It
grabbing
is.
it.
Yes. You don't care about that letter. Maybe that's what they want, and that's why they lead with their best, because it's like sets them up for the entire year. Maybe.
Yeah. Because they do ultimately have a great legacy of consistently great whiskey.
Yeah.
But they're not infallible. I think my review of the 24F 10-year bourbon is a great example of that. I gave that whiskey a 2.5 out of 5. It's just not good.
Sorry, Michters.
It's just not a good bottle of whiskey, and I'm ultimately quite disappointed. Now, I didn't even buy that bottle. I had my friend John buy that bottle on my good recommendation because I was like, oh, I'm hearing good things about the 24. I haven't tried it yet. You go ahead and buy it. And we opened it together, and we're both disappointed. And he was like, well, do you want to take it home and do a review? I'm like, yeah, this needs to get talked about. So I did ultimately do that. So in a way, I got the free media bottle, and that didn't persuade me to give it a better review than it should have. It was upon tasting it 3 times, I just had ultimately evaluated it as not that great of a whiskey. So lots of questions, very few answers, but Michter's 10-year bourbon continues to be the source of very interesting discussions this year. I think we should continue this discussion. I want to see people down in the comments weighing in with their opinions. What do you think about the letter theory? Is it marketing? Let me know your opinion. Well, Jess, what other examples of bottle-to-bottle variation could we explore?
We could try to look at Russell's or Stagg.
Russell's, I would say, is like the hallmark of consistency.
Okay.
Russell's single barrels, I feel like, are so consistent no matter what they do. There are people that start to pick apart, because of that consistency, they start to pick apart where the whiskey came from, which warehouse it was stored in.
Yeah.
People go crazy for like a Camp Nelson B or a Camp Nelson E particular barrel of Russell's because they're so consistent that they're searching for where they can find variation.
So it's like the opposite end.
It is the opposite end of the spectrum of bottle-to-bottle variation. I think it's an incredible story of consistency.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Russell's for a bit.
Yeah.
And I think the story of Wild Turkey in relation to consistency is a story of consistency across like 100 years. We had the great pleasure of doing a Wild Turkey tasting where we were sipping through things like the original Old Rippy, McBrayer.
Yeah.
And I think the story throughout that whole tasting, throughout 100 years of whiskey history, was that of consistency.
Yeah.
I mean, Wild Turkey in general only has 2 mash bills. They got a bourbon mash bill and a rye mash bill. How consistent can you get? And we often talk about things in relation to, pot still versus column still. We're obviously big fans of flavorful pot still whiskey.
Right.
I think Wild Turkey is one of the great examples of delicious column still whiskey. Yes. I think they have a very old, continuously operational column still that has served them very, very well for many years.
Yeah.
And ultimately that column still does produce that consistent whiskey. Yeah. So there is something to be said about column still when column still is done right.
For over 100 years.
It's insane. But in relation to Russell's single barrels that we have here, I mean, these are also the epitome of consistency. I mean, I think people in the whiskey world in general go to store shelves and they see a bottle of Russell's and they can always pick that up and know that they're going to like it, regardless of who picked it.
Yeah.
It is the opposite end of the spectrum of single barrel, where even though this is a single barrel, anybody that picks one typically produces a great Russell's pick.
Yes.
Now, there's still a spectrum there as well, but I don't think anybody that goes and selects a barrel of Wild Turkey for the Russell's Reserve bourbon label has ever left disappointed. But I guess to lean in on the bottling month discussion that we were having around Michter's, the Russell's single barrels also seem to have a little bit of a trend as far as when they like to dump and bottle their barrels. So you'll see on this single barrel that I selected, this is a Camp Nelson B barrel that I did with Liquor Junction. You can see the LJ Whiskey Family and Mass Bourbon Alliance as my group. This is a Floor 5 Camp Nelson B barrel, and you can see that bottling date is right first thing 2023 January. Does that lend some credence to the theory that bottling in the winter is better? I think in general I've seen a lot of bottling dates between October and March for Russells. Is that a bit of tribal knowledge that you think, the Russell family has in their back pocket where they know they're getting better results out of winter bottling dates?
Yeah, it could be. Or it just could be that that's when everyone's available to do it at the distillery.
It could be staffing, sure.
It could be staffing. Yeah, it could be.
I think there's perhaps something to that.
I'm curious if distilleries, if they have a preference for when they're making the majority of the whiskey. And I don't know. I would be curious to see what distilleries do with their operations. Now that I'm thinking about bottling lines and all that stuff, there's got to be a method to the madness. It can't just be chaos. It can't be oh, I feel like this barrel's ready to go, and then they go and do it. I think there's got to be a method. So we as consumers would hope that it is quality based, but I think we are also touching on how marketing and getting it out and keeping the money coming in influences that as well. So how do you tease that apart? I don't think you can.
Subtle differences between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think this actually could go on a discussion perspective is maybe away from single barrels, which are inherently easy to marry because they are marrying with themselves throughout their whole maturation process, right?
Yeah.
This is a 9-year single barrel. It spent all 9 years in that one vessel. It hasn't been blended with disparate distillate that has maybe a different viscosity or a different age to it. And so when we start talking about things like blends, I think the conversation changes completely because I think a single barrel is almost inherently ready to go into a bottle right away.
Right.
There isn't this waiting period where you have to worry about things mixing into kind of a consistent flavor profile because the flavor profile within that single barrel is already consistent.
Yeah.
You can just stick a straw in it, put it right into a bottle, and I think every bottle is going to taste the same. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I would absolutely agree, yes.
A single barrel of whiskey that has not been mixed or changed or water added at any point in its maturation is ready to just go right into a bottle, maybe with some chill filtering, maybe with whatever, char removal process the distillery might have. I think they need to use the right equipment too, so maybe we can speak to some of that equipment. But I think the single barrels are inherently ready.
Yes, I would agree.
So run it right through a stainless steel line with the right filters in place. It's ready for glass.
Yeah.
Cool. Now blend me 200 single barrels. We want to make a batch of whiskey. Call it a batch of bourbon. We want to blend 200 barrels together. Can you just put all those 200 barrels into a container, shake it up, and send it into a bottle?
No. They gotta hang out and marry. The flavors gotta marry.
Yeah. So that term in general is one that is well known in the whiskey world, obviously. I think anybody that has done novice blending, even in an infinity barrel, knows that you stick something new into it, you shake it up, it's not ready yet. It's not cohesive.
No.
I think anybody with a really good palate can tell you that a rushed blend, mix two things together, shake it up, taste it, you can almost taste both subcomponents. They haven't formed into one yet.
Yeah.
So if you say you mixed a bourbon and a rye, I could probably stick it in a glass and go, oh, sometimes I'm getting some bourbon notes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm getting some rye notes. They're disparate.
Yes.
They're separated a little bit.
Disjointed, yeah.
Disjointed is often a term that we'll use in whiskey reviewing to highlight when that is the case.
Yeah. And that's why we have master blenders on a team at a distillery. It's because they are masterfully blending whatever in theory. So if it was really marrying didn't make a difference, I don't think those people would exist on a distillery team.
Yep. Right. Why is there a role for it
Right.
if it's not important?
Right.
So I think there's probably, a couple of distinct categories for the amount of time that you might do something like that. And I think it's inherent to the process at work. So I think there are things like Murph Quint's project at Cedar Ridge, he's working with so many components. I think he has to spend extra amount of time making sure that they blend together and form a cohesive profile.
Yeah. Yeah. That was really interesting to learn about his process. And I think he's doing American single malt type projects, which we've talked about. We wrote a whole review on the Wine Club that recently came out. And we also took part in that quintessential blending experience, which was really, really neat. And I still have to try. We were able to take little samples home. I still have to try mine because he was even speaking to like, oh, you're not going to really taste what you just blended until maybe a month or 2 months from now. So those flavors can all hang out and get comfortable with each other. So it was a really neat experience. And I think it's maybe made you and I more aware of different batches being blended from bigger, like the powerhouse distilleries, and getting curious about the differences between, I see the Stagg bottle behind you, the differences between those Stagg batches that if anyone has been reading your reviews on amongstthewhiskey.com, they know that you've been very vocal with the the releases lately. So I think it's a great conversation to have because it's not single barrel variation, right? This is a little bit more complex. It's talking about
Many barrels.
It's talking about blending. It's talking about a master blender, a palette, a team. So, yeah, I think this is a discussion that needs to be out here in the community more. It's important.
Yeah, let's continue to elevate it.
Yes.
Do you remember how long Murph said that the Wine Club blend was marrying for?
He said that was his biggest project yet. And I think it took him, I think it was between 4 and 6 months. But the Untitled Cigar Malt project, I think that took him about 2 to 3 months. And I don't know. I would have to go back to my notes. But I know that the Wine Club took longer. And he was really proud of it. And he should be because it's a fantastic blend.
Yeah, spectacular whiskey.
Yeah, but he was definitely like, I'm ready to release this into the world. I'm tired of, but I don't want to mess with it anymore. Is I think what he said. He's like, I'm ready to be done.
He was ready at 6 months. It was finally in a point where he was like, this is spectacular.
Yes.
And so, to your other example, big distilleries that are producing 4 of these blends per year, they don't have 6 months to work on a project like this.
Right.
So are they inherently rushed? When you look at maybe the example of the recent batches of Stagg Jr., where we saw 3 batches at the end of the year, right? There was the typical summer, and historically Stagg Jr. has been 2 batches a year, a summer release, a winter release. That's 6 months of really being an expert in your craft, producing a blend that you're truly proud of and can stand behind. And I think Murphy accomplished that obviously with Wine Club.
Right.
But are some of these bigger distilleries capable of doing that? Is it the same team doing all 4 blends? Are they staggering it through the year to be able to get 6 months of maturation time? Yeah. Do they have blending tanks that are big enough to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, you look at even High West as an example, actually. Mm-hmm. So their Midwinter Night's Dram, they have since far surpassed their blending tanks capabilities for how often they can get bottles through, right? They have to bottle on different days because they can only bottle so many bottles in a day. Their blending tanks are gargantuan, like tens and hundreds of thousands of gallons. That release is a once per year. I think they have enough time to get a fully married project, but they also might be scaling beyond the capability of their blending prowess, where they're blending so many components that they're not really able to steer it at all. You might throw another 20, 30, 40 barrels of something in there, and it might not change the profile at all. So it's quite a fickle beast, this blending thing.
Yeah.
And it goes to your point, having a master blender is really important, and one that actually knows what they're doing.
It also speaks to just the importance of transparency. For me, at least, when I'm, going to go and like get behind a brand like Cedar Ridge, for example, I'm a huge fangirl of them, but they are a craft distillery that is relatively transparent with what they're doing. Buffalo Trace, and I've written about this, it's all like smoke and mirrors, and they're just like, here's a little bit of stuff, you can figure it out,
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about the Stagg batches recently, and you've questioned if it's a change in the blending team, but we don't really, they don't even give us their mash bills, it's so, and I understand that the reasons why, but I want transparency. If I'm going to get behind a brand, I'm not just going to do it because it's a super hyped up bottle like Stagg or whatever. It needs to be of quality, and I think some of that quality comes from a distillery being transparent with what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think it is possible to be quality without being transparent too, but then you don't understand the reasoning why.
Right.
And when things change, you're left scratching your head. You're even more in the dark on why things changed.
And then you got to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Which is what we're trying to do.
That's a good transition. I think we should talk about Stagg Jr. a little bit. Russell's was a spectacular example of bottle-to-bottle consistency, really good example of barrel-to-barrel consistency, and even year-to-year consistency. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is probably my pinnacle distillery. When I want to talk about consistency, Wild Turkey's probably my number one distillery that I would call consistent. Yeah. They are the dictionary definition of consistency.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
Yeah. These guys, however, they've been on my shit list a little bit recently. 23C, in particular, the 23C batch of Stagg Jr., I think was probably the worst batch of Stagg Jr. that I've ever had. And this is coming from somebody that's had most of the batches. I have batch 12 to today on my shelf right now. You want to explore any of them and the differences between them, we can do that in a heartbeat. And I do that often. I often will do that in my reviews of the most recent batches. I'll use a previous batch as my benchmark of quality.
Yeah, we did that with, what one did we review? 23C?
We did 23C with batch 17 as the counterexample, and there was no competition.
No,
I mean, batch 17 was spectacular. 23C was just a hot mess.
It was such a hot mess. Yeah.
But I think that goes to the fact that we saw 3 batches in the last month of 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, they just rapid fired them out. I honestly thought 24D was a fake or a joke. Everybody on the internet was like, oh, there's a 24D, and it was probably 2025 before anybody saw it.
Yeah. I was really surprised when you got it in. I was like, what? There's what?
It is, in fact, real, though. There is such thing as batch 24D. It is 127.4 proof. It is listed in the Stag Hub article. It exists. Now, should it exist is a different question.
You haven't written that review yet, have you?
I've not published my thoughts on 24D.
Is this a spoiler? Are you spoiling?
I have 2 tastes behind me on the 24D, and neither of them have been all that favorable.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll use batch 17 as my benchmark again in another kind of final taste, head-to-head. But, yeah, I mean, when we're talking about things to circle back to our 6-month blending time on Cedar Ridge Wine Club, there's absolutely no way that they had 6 months to do a proper marrying of 24D, 24C, or 24B. They really all came out like the same time.
I'm curious if it truly was like they bottled it and then they went and put it on the shelves, or was it something with maybe regulations and they got stalled? Maybe C or B was bottled earlier in the year. Maybe C was bottled in, I don't know, August or September, but then they ran into something that caused them to have to wait. They don't give you the bottling date, right, on Stagg? They
have the laser codes that only say the year. The rest of the letters may actually give away better timing than meets the eye.
Because it seems ridiculous to release that many in such a short amount of time in like all aspects. Why wouldn't you be spacing them out? You know, it just seems kind of, and it's like the first time that that's ever happened. So I'm just curious if like maybe something happened on a regulatory side that made them have to wait.
That's an interesting theory. My mind goes more to the marketing side.
Okay. Yeah.
I honestly think, somebody from Parent Corp, Sazerac there was like, hey, market's trending down. Let's get as much Stagg Jr. into the market as possible so that the people that are kind of new maybe can get hooked or they can get excited that there's better distribution for Stagg Jr. this year. Let's crank out 4 batches this year. That'll get people excited. And maybe that decision came in August of 2024. And then you have a blending team that's like, oh, great, we have to make 3 blends in the next 3-4 months that we can stand behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, how can you make a quality blend? One, a quality blend that you can taste through and know what the final bottling is going to taste like. Because you have to know what it's going to taste like at the end of marrying, at the end of blending. And I mean, what's kind of hilarious too is oftentimes at barrel picks, you'll see people going, oh, let's make a micro blend, and they'll start mixing together their single barrels, and they'll taste it at the time of tasting, and maybe that's fueled by a little bit of drunkenness, but people will get really excited about a little micro blend that they made in a glass, but that's not what the final bottling is going to taste like.
No.
Blending is not something that you can rush, and I think for me, 24C and probably 24D just feel rushed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there are disparate components. It feels disjointed. It does not feel fully integrated.
That also has me wondering about bottling. Because didn't you have a few people say that they really liked 23C or 24C? Didn't you have a few people be like, this is great. My bottle is fine. So where single barrel and bottling, probably there's not much of a difference. I wonder if a blended bottling from bottle to bottle has a difference.
This is the crux of the discussion. You're reining us back in. I absolutely love it, Jess. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So I did obviously have a very vocal opinion on 24C, and I had some people reach out and they were like, I had the opposite experience. I love this batch.
Right.
And none of these people were really trusted palates that I know personally, so I don't know how much credence to give their opinion on the fact that they liked it. They might be more, novice drinkers that have not had every batch of Stagg Jr. that I've had, so maybe not the same breadth of experience. And that's not to say that my palate is inherently better. Everybody tastes whiskey in their own way, and my palate isn't the end-all be-all palate. I'm just giving my experience based on all the things that I've had, which is a lot of whiskey.
Yes.
Especially in relation to Stagg Jr., right? I've had all the old batches that have been proven to be very delicious by many, many people.
Yeah.
So despite that, I do have a bit of an experiment actually coming up, and folks can definitely look forward to this, but I got a sample of somebody else's bottle of 24C to compare against my own bottle of 24C. That will be very informative, I think, for me to know if there is inherently bottle-to-bottle variation. Maybe it's the beginning of the run versus the end of the run. You get some of those heavier compounds at the bottom of a blending tank that come out first, depending on where the outlet is in relation to the equipment. Or it goes back to the lack of marrying time. I think a not well-married blend could have pockets of great whiskey in it and pockets of terrible whiskey in it. And some of those pockets of terrible whiskey went into one bottle, and some of those pockets of great whiskey went into another bottle. And so people may be having a very real experience of them loving their bottle of Stagg Jr. 24C and me hating the bottle that I have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you think about the older batches, and this type of discussion didn't seem to exist with obviously the older batches. So this gets into a whole nother issue of just an oversaturated market, more whiskey enthusiasts and appreciators here speaking vocally. It's like, is there something to pick apart, or are we just picking it apart because there's so much out there that we almost have to pick it apart? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from. Is it just the fact that we're probably the most educated consumers that the whiskey world has seen in 100 years?
Right. Yes, that's my point. Yeah.
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 Are we the most experienced and the most attentive that anybody's been in this space
Yeah.
for 100 years of distillation? Have people
Yeah.
just kind of gotten comfortable with the fact that there's 10 Kentucky distilleries and they all, have a flavor profile? And I think your historical whiskey drinker was looking for consistency, and your modern whiskey drinker is looking for variability. And so, is that the distillery trying to meet the demands of the market in variability and producing a nuanced spirit? Or is it the whiskey enthusiast, we're just really clamoring for something new when
Yeah.
the label is the same except for the little letters in the corner and the
Right.
proof every year?
Right.
Are we just yearning for something that's different? I think there's nuance, and then there's quality, and there's almost its own kind of barometric pressure, its own reading of quality. Anybody, I think, any good taster or good distiller can find faults, right? Anything that suggests that the distillation run went like too far into the tails or something like that. Like, faults are one thing, and then there's personal preference too. So
Yeah.
that's its own whole animal that we could discuss too.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Endless.
And then maybe just perhaps the last example of where we might attribute bottle-to-bottle variation would be that the Stagg Jr. blending team, whoever's in charge of managing the flavor profile for Stagg Jr., has maybe turned over.
Yeah.
Maybe new palates involved. What I've kind of noticed in some of these most recent batches, and I think you picked it up in our tasting of 24C as well, was this little bit of a licorice note.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of a common theme in the most recent batches. So I wonder, did the blending team turn over and their palates are just kind of aligning to that licorice note?
Sure. Yeah.
Are they aiming to do that? If so, I think we're probably going to be a little disappointed if that's a dominant note in Stagg Jr. moving forward, because it's never been historically. And then I guess the true final theory would be that the Buffalo Trace stocks in their warehouse that they've had set aside for Stagg Jr. are just not aging the same that they have in past years.
Yeah.
There may have been a magical meetup of weather conditions that just made maturation in the 2018 to 2022 range inherently better for aging whiskey, and just for whatever reason the 2024 bottlings and barrels that were selected are just, they're aging differently.
Yeah.
That seems the least likely to me. I think, climate is pretty consistent in Kentucky, and people have been producing whiskey there obviously for hundreds of years.
Right.
And I don't know if we've really seen that inherent, oh, that year was no good, or oh, that year was better than others. And that actually is a thing. People will talk in, vintages of certain national distillers products.
Right.
Oh, 88 was the year to get, or something.
Yeah.
So maybe there is credence to that. I'll throw it out as a theory so people can digest it, think about it, talk to your friends about it, drop a comment, continue the conversation.
Definitely.
Well, Jess, I think we have beat this horse to absolute death. We have explored many, many sources of bottle-to-bottle variation. I think we covered the really big ones, the big running theories that we've had for why certain bottlings of certain distilleries' products have been different this year versus previous years. I'm very interested to continue this conversation with our distiller friends, people that we know in the industry. I'm definitely going to go out and do a little bit of homework, and I look forward to continuing this conversation as we have more information.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing what people say after they watch this video.
Any parting remarks for our fans at home?
Enjoy your Michters, but be aware of that letter.
Well said, well said. And honestly, that should be more common even in just the whiskey reviewer space. I want to see people calling out their barrel numbers all the way through. I want the whole character set. I want to see 24D1137, whatever your barrel number is, give it to me so I can know if we're having the same experience.
Yeah.
If people need to compare their own palate against yours as whiskey reviewers, it's important to have that benchmark so that we're talking about the same thing. It'd be like me eating a piece of cheddar, you eating a piece of brie, and we're trying to talk about the same notes.
Wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work. We got to be talking about the same product here.
The details are important. They are important.
Devil is in the details.
The devil is in the detail.
Well, Jess, I really appreciate you joining in today, weighing in on this very important subject.
Yes.
If folks want to find you on the internet, how can they find you?
I'm on Instagram. My handle is Giggles and Sips with an N. And my website is jessmyth.com. I'm I'm an author too, but that's okay.
We love it. You have many talents, and our favorite talent of yours is your ability to pick apart whiskey in a very thoughtful manner. So thank you again for all your contributions, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, folks, that is going to do it for today. Until next time, keep it amongst the whiskey.